Welcome back. This is the Ben Shapiro Show. We got a big hour coming up for you here. We're going to talk about gun control. Apparently, President Trump is going to propose some form of gun control today, or maybe a gun bill. It's unclear what exactly is in it, but the Democrats are saying no bill without background checks. We'll get to all of that. We'll also get to Chris Cuomo just making a mockery of himself in an interview with a Cambodian woman. He actually suggested that Pol Pot had nothing to do with Marxism and Leninism, which is what we call the no true Scotsman fallacy. This is the fallacy that suggests that if you don't like something, then it didn't belong to the category. So in other words, communism has never really been tried. That's the no true Scotsman fallacy. Well, we'll get to that in just a little while. We have a lot to get, but let's talk for a second about Israel's election. So coming up in the next 48 hours is Israel's second election within like 6 months or 8 months. According to Reuters, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu stepped up a bid for far-right votes 2 days before a closely contested election, convening his cabinet in the occupied West Bank and having it approve legal status for an unauthorized outpost. Okay, first of all, there's nothing under international law that says that Israel is barred from building in the so-called West Bank in Judea and Samaria. Those are at best disputed territories. Netanyahu's caretaker government met on Sunday in the Jordan Valley, a largely agricultural area which he announced on Tuesday he intends to annex if he wins a fifth term. Israeli cabinets have rarely held sessions in the West Bank. Now, in reality, so is that a bit of an election gambit? Of course it is. But is it illegal? No. And not only is it not illegal, his opponents in the same exact race are celebrating the fact that Netanyahu is talking about doing something with regard to the Jordan Valley. The Jordan Valley is a strategically important area for Israel. It always has been. And this bizarre notion that Netanyahu is annexing the territory as opposed to applying Israeli sovereignty. Annexation and applying Israeli sovereignty are not the same thing. There's a guy named Mitchell Bard who writes about this sort of stuff. He says, Netanyahu's statement was widely misreported as calling for annexation of the territory, but he chose his words carefully. He said applying sovereignty, which Ariel Davidson of the Federalist notes, has a different meaning. A nation cannot annex land over which it already has sovereign claims, meaning that it's not that this land is owned by the Palestinians. It never was owned by the Palestinians. This land was owned by the Jordanians. It was lost in a war, and then Israel took it over. As with other issues related to the status of the disputed territories, says Mitchell Bard, the wisdom of such a move may be debated. However, it is important to know some of the facts about the Jordan Valley. There are Jewish settlements in the Jordan Valley dating all the way back to 1967, that in any prospective peace deal, those areas would end up in Jewish territory. Yitzhak Rabin, who was the sponsor of the Oslo Accords, also wanted those areas to be under Israeli control because the Jordan Valley has to be under Israeli control or the Jordan River could be cut off from Israel's population. It is also true, as I say, that the Blue and White Party, Netanyahu's chief opponents in this election, actually support him. I mean, according to an interview in the New York Times, the Blue and White Party supports his basic idea here, or in the Jerusalem Post. They say the Blue and White Party said it was pleased to see he was adopting Blue and White's plan for recognizing the Jordan Valley. So the international media are trying to turn the Israeli election into a referendum on Netanyahu. Netanyahu is the obstacle to peace. If only we got rid of Netanyahu, everything would be all better. And they've had it out for Netanyahu since Barack Obama had it out for Netanyahu. And Barack Obama had it out for Netanyahu because he wanted to see a widely reshaped Middle East in which Israel's influence was diminished, in which Iran's influence was maximized. I mean, Obama was not lying about this. He was pretty obvious. He kept talking about Iran being a well-respected regional power and how he saw the Israel-Palestinian issue as one of the key wheels to turn in order to achieve some sort of balance of power in the Middle East. Now, as we have seen, that all turned out to be a bunch of nonsense. The fact is that Israel and Palestinians have nothing to do with the broader Middle East. Israel has made no concessions to the Palestinian Authority over the last several years, nor should they. And yet war has not really broken out there, specifically because the Saudis are not interested in backing the Palestinians, neither are the Jordanians, neither are the Egyptians. The only people who are interested in pushing Palestinian terrorist aspirations are exactly the sorts of groups that back terrorists in the first place. We're talking about the Turkish government, we're talking about the Iranian government. In any case, Reuters suggests at this new meeting, the government announced it had approved Netanyahu's proposal to turn the outpost of Mevo'ot Yericho into a formal settlement 20 years after it was established as a farming community in the Jordan Valley without state sanction. Didn't require state sanction, by the way. In public remarks at the session, Netanyahu said it would be up to the government formed after Tuesday's election to grant final approval. Now, according to Reuters, this is all about how brutal Netanyahu is, appealing to far-right voters and Likud's own supporters to turn out in large numbers, Netanyahu has been portraying himself as being in lockstep with ultranationalists over retaining West Bank land through annexation. Well, no, that was always the Likud platform. The Likud platform was that Israel would retain an enormous amount of the Jewish settlement activity in any peace deal. By the way, that is also the perspective of blue and white. It's amazing to watch as the media attempt to turn Netanyahu into the villain here, as opposed to the reality. The peace deal died a long time ago. It died because the Palestinians refused, no less than 4 or 5 times, any effort at peace. They refused the original Oslo Accords. Then they refused a deal tried to cut by Bill Clinton in 2000 between Ehud Barak and Yasser Arafat. Arafat walked away from the table and started an intifada. There was an attempted peace deal by Ariel Sharon. That was balked at by the Palestinians. Ehud Olmert tried one. That was balked at by the Palestinians. Netanyahu himself, in his first go-round in the 90s, signed over 8% of Judea and Samaria in the Wye River Accords. But always the problem for the media is that Israel is too intransigent, not that its opponents are terrorists, which is the real problem here. Opinion polls right now show that Likud and its main challenger, the centrist Blue and White Party, are running neck and neck. There is no real division on these issues. Now, Blue and White may approach this more slowly, and maybe this is an election gambit. But again, this bizarre idea that you're going to be able to cut a different foreign policy with blue and white is not true. Now, the election polls are showing this thing very, very close. The latest election poll, so the way that it works in Israel is there are a variety of parties that get elected to Knesset. You have to have at least 4 seats to sit in the Knesset, which is 120 seats. And you need to form a majority by putting together a coalition. Now, last time, Netanyahu did have enough for a majority. The problem was Avigdor Lieberman, who leads one of the parties, the Yisrael Beitenu party, refused to join the coalition without earning some concessions from Netanyahu, so Netanyahu simply called a new election. It looks like the results are going to be pretty similar. Right now, blue and white are neck and neck with Likud, but the other parties that would side with Netanyahu in the elections are winning more seats. So Yamina, which is the sort of right-wing alternative to Likud, is supposed to win anywhere between 7 and 10 seats in the various polls. Labor has turned into a non-party, which is unbelievable. Right? Labor used to be the other major party in Israel all the way up until about 1980 with the election of Menachem Begin. Labor had every prime minister of Israel, and now they are winning 4 to 6 seats in this election, which is truly incredible. So we will see how this ends up. If you had to lay odds right now, you would suggest that Netanyahu probably retains the prime ministership. And that, again, is not because the people of Israel have fallen for tyranny or anything like that. That's because everyone in Israel agrees on security. And they know at this point that regardless of whether they nominate Netanyahu to lead the government or whether they nominate Benny Gantz to lead the government, that security is only going to be assured by taking a strong stance against terrorism and by refusing to make deals with the Palestinian Authority. Nonetheless, there is this bizarre notion in the media that whenever there's an impasse in the Middle East, the only liberal democracy in the area is at fault. There's a long piece in the Washington Post today by Robert Kagan. It's a truly egregious piece called Israel and the Decline of the Liberal Order. It's a quite disgusting piece. And the idea is that Bibi Netanyahu is siding with the nationalists as opposed to the liberal internationalists, and that really it would be in Israel's best interest if they would just side with the liberal internationalists, like France and Germany. There is only one problem. Those are precisely the states that have had some of the worst anti-Semitism problems in Europe. Jews are fleeing there en masse. Those are also the governments that are trying to make concessions to the Iranians as the Iranians openly call for the extermination of every Jew in the region. It's unbelievable. But this is how the media are going to cover this thing. Again, Netanyahu is the bad guy. By the way, as I say, there are a lot of people I know on the right who don't want Netanyahu to be prime minister anymore. They want Benny Gantz, just so that the media will recognize that this is not a Netanyahu problem. This is the rest of the world disliking Israel. And that's the problem. When you side with terrorists over Israel, you're doing morality wrong. Okay, so as I say, there's this long piece by Robert Kagan all about how Netanyahu is the bad guy. He says, in the growing confrontation between the liberal world order and its anti-liberal, nationalist, and authoritarian opponents, which side does Israel want to be on? I should note here that Robert Kagan says that Trump is a fascist. Like outright, he says he's a fascist, which of course is silly. The question would have been absurd even a decade ago, when Israelis still regarded themselves as members in good standing in the liberal world. But in recent years, Israeli foreign policy has been trending in a decidedly anti-liberal direction. Now, this is where you get into weird territory, because the idea is that Israel is anti-liberal if they refuse to cave to the French or the Germans or to Jeremy Corbyn. Okay, I don't judge liberalism by refusing to cave to people who want you to commit national suicide. I'm not going to judge President Trump's small government liberalism on the basis of whether he kisses Justin Trudeau's ass. It's ridiculous. According to Robert Kagan, since the middle of 2015, the Israeli government has embraced Hungary's avowedly illiberal Prime Minister Viktor Orban, worked to forge close ties with Poland's ruling Law and Justice Party, despite its limitations on civil liberties and legislation outlawing public discussion of Poland's role in the Holocaust, warmly embraced Brazil's right-wing nationalist leader Jair Bolsonaro. Well, that one's because Bolsonaro has endorsed moving the embassy to Jerusalem, provided a state visit for President Rodrigo Duterte of the Philippines, who once likened himself to Adolf Hitler, worked consistently to woo Russian President Vladimir Putin, offered a 25-year contract to a Chinese state-owned firm to manage the port of Haifa, which has often hosted the U.S. Sixth Fleet, and provided consistently strong support for the military dictatorship in Egypt, as well as the authoritarian sheikdoms of the UAE and Saudi Arabia. Now, I will note a couple of things here. You know which other countries have made way for Vladimir Putin? Well, let's see. First of all, Barack Obama did it pretty often. Second of all, pretty much all of the countries of Europe. As far as Hungary and Poland, those are countries that are helping Israel out. Israel exists in an international order. The United States exists in an international order. You know what we do on a fairly regular basis? Deal with people we don't like. I mean, the United States, under Barack Obama and Bill Clinton and George W. Bush, and now Donald Trump, has dealt with the Saudis. This has been true for a very long time. If it is a mark of illiberalism to deal with states so that you can achieve your national interest, then I'm not sure what to say about that. Is Israel supposed to make its own citizens less safe to please Emmanuel Macron? Hey, how is that supposed to work? Netanyahu insists he is only leading Israel out of international isolation. But the common denominator among all these new partners has been an avowed hostility toward liberalism and the liberal world order, and the prime minister himself has become something of a central figure in the global non-liberal camp. Yoram Hazony, a conservative Israeli thinker and one-time aide to Netanyahu, has frankly proclaimed Israel's solidarity with those he calls holdouts against universal liberalism in Hungary, Poland, and France. Okay, now this is just ridiculous. Okay, the reason this is ridiculous is because it's a complete misread of Yoram Hazony, whose books I have read. When he says that Netanyahu is a holdout against universal liberalism, he means a world without borders. And by the way, the United States should be a holdout against quote-unquote universal liberalism. There's no liberalism that encompasses every country on earth. Of course, America should have her own national interest and own national policy. We have our own national principles. But again, if Israel refuses to cave to the quote-unquote international community, apparently they're doing something very, very wrong. Now, as I say, it's going to be a great shock to all of these folks, including Robert Kagan, if Blue and White wins and then pursues exactly the same foreign policy. What do you think that Blue and White's going to do? Cut off relations with Hungary? Cut off relations with Poland? In favor of what? Hanging out with Jeremy Corbyn, exactly? Now, pretending that Israel is a free actor in the world and thus can just pick and choose its friends is ridiculous. Israel has never been in that position. But Robert Kagan says, what makes Israelis think if the United States were to cease supporting the liberal world order and begin shedding the alliances it created after World War II, the only ally it would not shed would be Israel? Okay, again, Israel has never suggested that the United States violate its alliances with France and Britain. They suggest that the United States broaden its alliances among countries with common interest. But the Washington Post printed this garbage because the idea is that Israel is the great sinner. Israel's rapprochement with European right-wing nationalism has required winking at Poland's law, making it a crime to suggest Polish involvement in the killing of Jews during World War II. It has required ignoring the history of Hungarian nationalism amid Orban's profession of affection for Israel. Yes, as it turns out, foreign policy often includes you winking at behavior that you hate because you want to. The United States does it too. Every country does it. But the idea, of course, is that the Netanyahu government is bad. Why? Well, because Netanyahu likes Trump. And because Netanyahu has made overtures to the evangelical movement in the United States. If the idea here is that Israel is the bad guy in the world because it has had to seek allies other than the people who have been undermining its existence, tough. And I think most Israelis feel that way too. Robert Kagan says, there's a certain short-sighted selfishness to current Israeli approach to the world. The price Israel paid for being born into the liberal world order was that it would have to suffer liberal criticisms and be held to liberal standards. Well, no. The price that Israel had to pay for existing is that Israel had to struggle to exist always and will continue to struggle to exist so long as there are people who believe that Israel is the sinner in the Middle East when it is the only democracy in the Middle East, apparently, now including Robert Kagan. The attempt to blame Benjamin Netanyahu for all the world's ills is pathetic insanity from people who don't know a damn thing about Israeli politics and who pretend not to understand regional politics as well. When I say that it is ridiculous to suggest that Benjamin Netanyahu is the result of him being a fascist, or that his policies are a result of illiberalism in Israel, that suddenly the Israelis, who have spent, the last 70 years, basically since 1948, spent the last 70 years building up the only liberal society in the Middle East, a society where 20% of the population is Muslim, a society where the third largest party in the Knesset is the Joint List, which is a list of Arab parties, some of whom call for the destruction of the state of Israel in the past. Okay, when there are people who say that Benjamin Netanyahu is that Israeli society, what happened? They suddenly went fascist or something, as opposed to maybe Israel is responding to the same threat to which it has always responded, namely people who want to wipe them off the face of the map. That is because they have an agenda. Okay, the way you know they have an agenda is because people keep taking people like Ilhan Omar seriously. So Ilhan Omar, the congresswoman from Minnesota, a disgrace to her profession, she was on Face the Nation, and she literally said that the very existence of Benjamin Netanyahu is an obstacle to peace, which is weird because Benjamin Netanyahu has only been prime minister since like 2008. So what happened in the 60 years prior to that? Magically, so I guess Netanyahu was prime minister that whole time? Or maybe not. Maybe it turns out there are lots of people who want to destroy Israel, and Ilhan Omar presumably would be one of them, because may Allah awake against Israel's hypnotism of the world. Here's Ilhan Omar, noted Jew lover, talking about how Netanyahu needs to be wiped off the earth, basically.
Do you stand by your call for a boycott of Israel?
I certainly hope that the people of Israel make a different decision. And my hope is that they recognize that his existence, his policies, his rhetoric really is contradictory to the peace that we are all hoping that that region receives and receives soon.
Does anyone really believe that Ilhan Omar would suddenly become pro-Israel if the Labor Party were in power? I mean, does she really believe that if Kachol V'Lavan, the second biggest party in Israel right now, if they were to take over, that suddenly Ilhan Omar would be like, you know what? Boycott's off. I love the Jews. They're awesome. Does anyone truly believe that about Turkey? Okay, Turkey has been funding Hamas, an actual terrorist group, for a decade. The head of Turkey, Erdogan, is an actual dictator, like an Islamic dictator who has attempted to crack down on his opponents, who just a couple of years ago arrested 100,000 people in conjunction with an alleged coup attempt on him. Okay, according to Reuters, Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu's announcement of his intention to annex areas of the West Bank following next week's elections shows Israel is becoming a racist apartheid regime, says Turkey's foreign minister. Weird, because, again, that apartheid regime, its third largest party is Arab, 20% of the population is Arab, and Arabs would be allowed to live in that annexed area, in the area over which Israel has declared sovereignty. You know who would not be allowed to live in this whole Palestinian area? Any Jews. It's very interesting to watch as people call Israel an apartheid state, where Muslims have more rights than anywhere in the Middle East. And yet, the Palestinian Authority, which is a terrorist regime, and if you're Jewish, you ain't going to live there anytime soon. They're the good guys in this. If you somehow mix that up, I have my doubts that the problem here is Benjamin Netanyahu. I think the problem probably is you. And the fact that the left across the West has somehow unified in opposition to Netanyahu, when again, Netanyahu was a result of Palestinian intransigence, it's just demonstrative of a long-lasting, deeply ingrained bias against the existence of the state of Israel, which is why Israel as a population has moved so far to the right that the Labor Party, which was their largest party for nearly all of their existence up to 1980, for all of their existence, is now a fringe party in Israel. That's why. Well, President Trump's trade war is apparently bearing some fruit. So according to CNBC.com just a couple of days ago, China has now added U.S. agricultural products to tariff exemptions ahead of trade talks. Now, Trump had tweeted out that this was going to happen, and the Chinese had denied that this was going to happen. Turns out Trump was telling the truth and the Chinese were fibbing. According to CNBC.com, China plans to exclude American farm goods, including soybeans, from tariffs in the latest move to ease trade tensions before the two countries restart trade talks next month. The Chinese Ministry of Commerce said Friday that China welcomed President Trump's decision to delay tariffs by 2 weeks and said it will exempt U.S. agricultural products such as soybeans and pork from additional tariffs. These farm goods add to the 16 types of U.S. products that will be exempt from tariffs. The exemption will be valid for a year through to September 16th, 2020. The move came after Trump said Thursday he'd consider an interim trade deal with China, even though he would not prefer it, meaning we may not have to sign a long-term deal here, but let's do something that at least eases the burden presumably for political reasons to get through 2020. Now, as we've been talking about on this program for the last several weeks, the fact is that China is America's largest geopolitical rival. China is attempting to expand its sphere of influence. They're expanding their Belt and Road program. They're expanding their 5G networks, attempting to bring other countries under their boot, or at least under their influence. And the United States should be seeing China as its opposition. It is also true that the tariffs on China have been hurting China worse than they have been hurting the United States, which makes sense. The United States is a far more powerful economy with exports to a lot of countries that are not China, while China's lead country of export is the United States by a huge, huge margin. President Trump had suggested he wanted to use tariffs in order to leverage China to remove tariffs on American agricultural products. Apparently, he has gotten that done. China's agriculture buying has been a sticking point in the trade battle, as Trump has repeatedly accused China of not following through on its promises. China said on Thursday that domestic firms have started making inquiries about prices of U.S. soybeans and pork. Chinese importers reportedly bought a total of 600,000 metric tons of soybeans from U.S. Pacific Northwest export terminals for October to December. Now, whether a bigger trade deal is coming is totally unclear at this point, but it is true that China's economy is really hurting. Laura He is a CNN business reporter. She reports China's economic slowdown keeps getting worse. That could give the country incentive to repair its trading relationship with the United States and take more steps to stimulate its economy. The country released data on Monday that showed industrial production, an important indicator for China's economy, increased by just 4.4% in August compared to a year earlier. That's worse than the sector's performance in July, when it grew by 4.8%, its weakest growth in 17 years. Now, the fact is that growth rates in China are juiced by fake numbers. China has exorbitant debt that it has taken out in order to subsidize its industrial industry. It's not just that. China also started off from a lower level. So when you're increasing your GDP, starting at a low level means exorbitant rates of increase. I remember back in the early 2000s, there was a lot of talk about Russia increasing its GDP year on year 7%. Well, when you start with a bad economy, it's a lot easier to increase your GDP year on year. Industrial production, according to CNN Business, is important because it measures the output of key businesses in China's manufacturing, mining, and utilities sector. The latest figure was also worse than the 5.2% growth analysts polled by Reuters expected. Other data released Monday by China's National Bureau of Statistics was also poor. Retail sales growth slowed to 7.5% in August, down from July's 7.6% year-on-year uptick. According to CNN, the world's second biggest economy has been struggling because of its trade war with the United States. It's also facing domestic challenges as it tries to rely less on debt to fuel growth. And that's been the big problem, right? We've been fooled by China's growth rate, which is based, again, on them borrowing exorbitant levels of cash and then expending it on everything from industrial subsidies to building completely empty cities to spur their supposed growth rates. Now, the nice thing for China is it's a communist regime. If things get too bad, all you have to do is repress a few billion citizens or a billion citizens, and everything is just fine. But the fact is that China's regime does rely on a consistent feeling of upward mobility. According to CNN.com, the new data comes as China's tense trade relationship with the United States appears to be improving at least a little bit. China announced last week about those agricultural tariffs being removed on American agricultural products. The weak data also fuels speculation about how China's central bank will continue responding to the slowdown. According to Ken Chung-Kintai, who is chief foreign exchange strategist for Asia at Mizuho Bank in Hong Kong, the People's Bank of China has taken several steps in recent weeks to boost the country's economy. Earlier this month, they reduced the amount of cash banks have to keep in reserve by slashing the reserve requirement ratio for the first time in 8 months. The goal there, presumably, is to sponsor lending. In August, the central bank launched a new loan prime rate that will become the benchmark for banks to price loans, a reform meant to support growth and employment. China has also allowed the yuan to depreciate to its lowest levels in more than a decade in recent weeks. But a weaker currency isn't likely to completely offset problems with tariffs and sluggish global demand. In other words, China is a little bit of an economic paper tiger. Now, that doesn't mean that they're a paper tiger in terms of global influence. The USSR was able to provide a serious counter threat to the United States simply based on their nuclear arsenal, even though their economy was significantly weaker than the United States' economy. Well, when it comes to China, the same could be true. They have 1 billion people. They have the world's largest standing military in terms of sheer manpower. They're obviously really aggressive and expansion-minded. With that said, the United States putting economic pressure on China as a long-term policy is, in fact, good policy. Now, what about the U.S. economy leading up to 2020? Interesting piece by Robert Schiller today Robert Shiller, of course, is the theorist who first created the idea of irrational exuberance. This, or at least popularized that idea, the idea that markets tend to react not in perfectly homo economist ways, not in perfectly rational fashion, but they react to emotional pushes. He's the Sterling Professor of Economics at Yale. He has a piece today in the New York Times talking about the idea that you could actually talk people into recession. He says, when will the next recession arrive? Economists are evaluating such factors as President Trump's endlessly shifting tariff policy, the monetary policy of the Federal Reserve and other central banks, and such leading indicators as the yields in the bond market. He says it's good to look at those things. They do provide insights, but this approach will not produce a definitive advance reading of a major shift from growth to contraction or recession. He says forecasting recessions is really, really difficult, but we actually have to insert into the discussion a factor that is not economic in nature, an examination of the popular narratives that may be infecting individual economic decision-making. In other words, President Trump has claimed that the media are trying to talk us into recession. Shiller seems to be arguing that that very well could happen. He says the probability that a recession will come soon or be severe depends in part on the state of ever-changing popular narratives about the economy. These are stories that provide a framework for piecing together the seemingly random bits of information one picks up from friends, the news, or social media. For consumers, these narratives affect decisions on whether to spend or save, whether to take a demanding or an easy job, whether to take a risk or stick with something safer. For business people, the prevailing narratives affect deliberations on whether to hire more help or lay off employees, whether to expand or retrench or even start a new enterprise. He says for most people, such important decisions are fraught with ambiguity and uncertainty, so we allow ourselves to be influenced by emotion. And you can see this happening, right? Maybe right now I'm considering buying a second investment property. But would I rather wait until 2021 when most economists are now saying a recession might arrive? Would I be a fool to buy into the market at this point? Now, I'm not looking at the bond yields. When I see that, I'm looking at the headlines. Shiller says, the widespread digitization of text combined with enhanced capabilities for natural language processing is beginning to give us new insights into the history of economic narratives. He says that narratives cluster around issues like public confidence or social norms regarding extravagance or modesty in consumption if it looks like you're spending too much money when everybody else is cutting back. Real estate booms and busts. He says it now appears that while September 15th, 2008 was a logical moment for the start of a panic, that's not really what happened. That was when Lehman Brothers, an old-line investment bank, failed. He says while this was a major economic event, the evidence suggests it didn't foster a vital narrative among the broad population. He says the big change came when the government seized Washington Mutual and sold its assets to J.P. Morgan Chase. He says that certain events can, in fact, push people to think differently about the economy, and so we have to be very careful about how we talk about the economy. He says new crises that shake up the economy often surprise economists because no exogenous cause appears to be a sufficient explanation for a downturn. People begin to suddenly frame current events in the context of stories they'd heard many times before. In other words, if enough people begin to act fearfully, their anxiety can become self-fulfilling, which is why President Trump actually, it turns out, may be statistically correct that we can talk ourselves into a recession. And meanwhile, the United Auto Workers is apparently striking against General Motors, which suggests they don't think a recession is right around the corner. Because if they did, they wouldn't be striking, would they? According to the Washington Post, about 49,000 General Motors employees walked off the job at midnight on Monday after negotiations between their union and the Detroit car giant unraveled over wages, healthcare, job security, and other issues. This is the first UAW nationwide strike since 2007. Now, you will notice the irony of a nationwide strike in 2007 because 2 years later, the federal government was bailing out GM. And so the idea then was that the management at GM was cruel to the workers. 2 years later, things were going so badly for GM that the federal government had to step in and infuse tens of millions of dollars into GM to keep them running. Negotiations that had been ongoing since July came to a head on Sunday afternoon. Union leaders announced the strike would begin 12:01 on Monday if the two sides could not renew an agreement in place since 2015. The UAW VP, Terry Ditz, he said, "We stood up for GM when they needed us most. Now we are standing together in unity and solidarity for our members, their families, and the communities where we work and live." Now, listen, I think that if you can get your workers to strike and you're not beating up scabs, this is perfectly legit. It's a perfectly legitimate private economic activity. If, however, this is all predicated on the idea that if GM goes south, the taxpayers bail them out to the tune of UAW earning money, the answer is no. And the only people who are in a position to evaluate the reality of that claim are the folks over at GM who got bailed out last time. According to the Washington Post, though GM brings in significant profits, $8.1 billion after taxes last year, it's grappling with massive changes to the auto industry. Family-friendly sedans have become less of an emphasis for Detroit automakers as consumers gravitate to SUVs and crossovers, as well as greener electric vehicles. In March, GM actually shuttered production at one of its plants in Lordstown, Ohio, and scaled back production of the Chevy Cruze. According to the Alliance of Auto Manufacturers, the broader vehicle industry supports nearly 10 million jobs and has historically accounted for about 3% of gross domestic product. About 220,000 people work in car manufacturing. But people are viewing GM's job cuts in Lordstown as signs that the economy is leaving parts of the country behind. If the UAW is striking to prevent the shuttering of non-effective factories, they're cutting into the future of a company, and presumably this will only be bailed out by Washington again. And then the CEOs will get blamed. This is exactly what happened last time. GM got blamed for a deal that they cut with the UAW that was a very, very rich deal for the UAW. And then GM had trouble. And then the bosses got blamed for being too nice to the workers who had spent UAW money electing Democrats to provide bailouts and pressure the owners of the factories. This is why government skews incentive structures. I'm all for negotiations between workers and employers, but those negotiations cannot be affected by the possibility that the government is going to step in and bail somebody out, or that the government is going to step in and pressure employers on behalf of employees. Well, we are watching as cities around the country governed by folks on the left consider killing charter schools. We are seeing this in New York City, where Bill de Blasio, the mayor, is now considering killing the only functioning schools in New York City, apparently on the grounds that they are not racially diverse enough. Joining us on the line to discuss all of this is Robert Pondicchio. He's the author of How the Other Half Learns. He's senior fellow at the Thomas B. Fordham Institute and a former inner-city public school teacher. He had an op-ed recently in the Wall Street Journal I talked to you about charter schools and why they are so much more successful than many of the other public schools, even in the same areas. Robert, thanks so much for joining the Ben Shapiro Show.
Hey, thanks for having me.
So why don't we begin with that simple question? Why are charter schools so successful as opposed to some of the other public schools that are in the same exact region?
Yeah, it's a mixed bag. I mean, many of them are more successful. Some are not. The ones that are tend to be better run, more focused. In the case of Success Academy, the ones that I write about in How the Other Half Learns, the parents do play a significant role. It's not that easy to get into them. I mean, you're lotteried in, but they expect a lot of parents, and the parents deliver that help.
So speaking of parental activity is a real taboo now in education. There's a lot of talk about we need extra funding. Democrats on the debate stage last week, they were asked for their education plans. Invariably, they included more funding for schools and very little talk of what could be done in order to create more of a culture of education for parents of all races. The only person who mentioned this was Joe Biden, who was immediately excoriated for it. What did you make of the Democrats' take on education?
Yeah, it's kind of a shame. Some of us are old enough to remember when this was a bipartisan issue, going back to No Child Left Behind around 2001 or so. So for a time, both Democrats and Republicans kind of linked hands and said, especially for inner city kids, look, we got to do better for these kids. We got to close the achievement gap. So, for 10 or 15 years, there was something like enough, let's say, bipartisan agreement that charter schools and urban charter schools in particular were good for kids. That's all fallen apart now, and now the race seems to be between, at least on the Democratic side, those who hate charter schools and those who really hate charter schools.
We're speaking with Robert Pondicchio. He's the author of the book How the Other Half Learns. Robert, when we talk about parent bodies and how we incentivize parents to actually do better for their kids, obviously you get into some very dicey territory because there's always accusations that you are engaging in racism when you even talk about, even on a non-racial basis, which parents are not doing enough in order to forward their kids, or you get accusations that certain parents are doing too much to forward their kids. These have been recent stories in places like the New York Times suggesting that upper class parents are spending too much money and time trying to make the situation better for their kids at the expense of lower income parents. How exactly are we supposed to rectify these problems if they are individual problems?
How much time do you have? I mean, look, let's be honest. In the main, the impulse of parents doing more for their kids is not a problem. That's what you want. These issues of unfairness, it's a little bit strange because, if you think about this, the orthodoxy in education, and frankly, even among charter school and ed reform people, frowns upon any kind of selectivity, right? We're supposed to be able to be able to achieve these results with any child. Well, I mean, that's a little bit naive. Moreover, we only impose that condition on certain people. So if you're affluent, for example, nobody tells you or me that you can't send your child to a private school or buy an expensive house in the suburbs where your property taxes are functionally private school tuition. But if you're poor, you're not supposed to be able to choose your school. So that's why I always say that the rich get excellence and the poor get equity. It turns out that's a really good formula for holding folks down.
Well, speaking about all of that, Joe Biden obviously suggested that record players were a solution to some of these problems. I mean, I do wonder if these problems are simply not solvable beyond a certain point. You can provide school choice, but what your research suggests is that putting this on teachers or putting this on school systems is actually unfair. That if you're looking at some of the things that these charter schools are doing, in maybe acting as a quasi-sorting mechanism for parental activity, that in the end, unless you're affecting behavior in the home, it's going to do very little to change things at the school level. What can be done on a school level to change things?
Yeah, I mean, this is why what I think that Success Academy has, whether they've stumbled upon this or this is aggressively part of their program, is kind of unknown or unknowable. But they really do seem to provide a self-selection mechanism. I mean, this for listeners who are my age, I'm in my 50s. You'll listen to this and you'll say, "Hey, this sounds an awful lot like Catholic schools of my parents' generation," and I think that's exactly right. I mean, these particular schools, I think, are for working class New Yorkers what Catholic schools might have been for blue collar folks of my parents' generation. But again, the problem is we just get uncomfortable with the idea that ambitious folks can self-select, and that's key. In other words, they're often accused of so-called cherry-picking parents, like culling away the most ambitious. What's actually happening is these folks are selecting themselves. There's really intrinsically nothing wrong with that. That's, again, like being involved with your child's education. We should want and encourage that. But as a public policy matter, it gets very, very dicey for all the reasons we've been discussing. It just makes us uncomfortable.
Robert Pondiscio, his book is How the Other Half Learns. Robert, thanks so much for your time and thanks for your insight. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Ben.
Well, coming up, we're going to be talking about the New York Times going after Brett Kavanaugh again. Do they have the goods this time? Because they didn't last time. Spoiler alert, the answer is no, but that's not going to stop Democrats from calling for impeachment. You're listening to The Ben Shapiro Show.